Welcome everyone, and thank you to our guests, members, and other participants for joining us for another ACEC Lunch and Learn webinar. My name is Caroline Andrews. I'm the President and CEO of the Association of Consulting Engineering Companies, British Columbia. Today we're meeting in hundreds of separate locations. We just heard almost 200 separate locations. And to unify us, we like to acknowledge that ACEC is based in the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, and in particular the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. ACEC-BC represents more than 9,500 people working in 80 consulting engineering firms across our province. Our association's purpose is to serve the interests of our members through advocacy, creating opportunities for collaboration, and building profile for members and the industry. During this unprecedented time, we are working together to support the consulting engineering companies in this province. We do miss meeting you in person, me especially. We continue, though, to seek opportunities to build connection between members, with our clients and partners at events like this, through our website and through our COVID-19 Resource Center, as well as our many committees and other networks. All of our operations, including events, are shifting now to the virtual environment so that we can continue to support your practice as you work from home and as you return to your offices. In the coming weeks, we'll continue to offer events that are of value to our members. Next week, we are still working on the exact title, but the session is intended to focus on infrastructure investment, with a focus on currently available programs and information to support members and their clients. Also next week is the ACEC-BC Annual General Meeting, hosted virtually on Thursday, June 11th. And on June 24th, we are delighted to be offering our first virtual client mixer with Metro Vancouver. More details are available soon. For advance notice of all of our events, please join our mailing list through the website. You can always stay up to date with us by visiting the ACEC-BC COVID-19 Resource Center on our website, which is acec-bc.ca, where you'll find regular updates, relevant industry content, and information from our partner network. There you can also connect with us through a feedback portal and provide us with your perspective on how your organization is managing and how we can help. Today, we're joined by two speakers from ACEC-BC, associate member firm Metrix and AXA-XL, to discuss the effective management of project change. During the presentation, the presenter will give us a few opportunities for questions. You can submit your questions using the Q&A dialog box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Anything we don't get to during the presentation, we'll try to cover at the end of the presentation. Our speakers today have also agreed to share the presentation to participants, and we'll send that to you in a direct email following the session. I'm pleased to introduce our speakers, starting with Rob McLeod, Professional Liability Insurance Broker at Metrix. Rob is an insurance broker with 10 years of risk management experience. He specializes in assisting architects, engineers, and construction professionals to manage their risk exposures through education and quality insurance solutions. Rob is an active member of the design professional community and regularly publishes articles relating to loss prevention. Also today, we're joined by Patricia Huntley, Risk Manager of Loss Prevention and Client Education, AXA-XL Design Professional Insurance. Patty is a risk manager for the North American Design Professional Unit of AXA-XL. She has 35-year career, including an extensive background in the AEC industry. Patty began her consulting career in 1989 with an environmental engineering firm, and subsequently for 14 years, she provided consulting services to the industry with a focus on project delivery and program management. As a member of AXA-XL's DP client education team, Patty works with brokers and trade associations like ours, providing the resources and education to empower AE industry professionals, architects and engineers, that's us, industry professionals to effectively manage risk in design and construction. Please join me in welcoming Rob and Patty.
Thank you, Caroline. I'm Rob at Metrix, and our team helps a few hundred consulting firms manage liability risks through specialized advice, educational articles, in-house workshops, and webinars like this. Patty is one of the many resources our clients have access to when they partner with ACEC-BC through Metrix for professional liability insurance. Patty, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Carolyn. Welcome everybody to Scope and Change Management. We're going to spend the next 90 minutes or so talking about scope and change management. I'm going to cover 4 topics. I'm going to start by talking about just what are the risks around scope and change on a project. And then I'm going to just back down a little bit and go back to some basic information on what is scope management. So scope management, then I'm going to talk about change management. And at the end, I want to walk through several tools that you can use to really help you keep track of, define, communicate change and scope change or additional services to your client. At the end of each section, as Carolyn mentioned, at the end of each section, I will stop and take any questions. You can type the questions in while I'm presenting, but I will also have time at the end of the program to answer additional questions. So let's get started. Does any of this sound familiar? All these small client changes are starting to add up, and I'm not quite sure how to explain to the client why they need to pay for them. 2, I am working with a new client and I'm really happy about it. 3, the client approved the changes we made verbally, and I noted their approval in our weekly and monthly progress reports, but I hadn't had time to get written approval for the additional work. Any problem with any of those? Well, small changes can add up. Number 2, new clients may not understand that small changes as well as large changes and additional services may be needed on projects, and it's really good to have a process that you talk with them about on this, particularly since they're a new client. And I'm going to talk about some of those processes. And 3, written approval is always critical on any additional services or additional work you provide for the client. So why do we care about this? ACEC-BC has, for the last 20 years, evaluated their claims and claim data, and what they've recognized in claims around errors and omissions in particular, what they've recognized is that there are errors and omissions, which we call technical risk drivers, but those claims are either brought forward or are created or exacerbated by non-technical risk drivers. And here is a list of our top 6 areas of non-technical risk drivers: communication, construction phase services, client selection, quality management, project team capabilities, negotiations, and contracts. Each of these 6 areas of non-technical risk drivers contribute to claims. We evaluated in the last 6 years, we evaluated over 11,000 claims that, and this data reflects those 11,000 claims. In these 11,000 claims, what we found is within communication, quality management, and contract and negotiations, there's a significant percentage of these risk drivers that are really driven by scope management, change, and change management. So I'm going to focus just for a few minutes on these risk drivers and how they drive claims or exacerbate claims for scope management and scope change. First of all, in communications, over 55% of the issues related to any kind of communication issue on a claim is lack of procedures to identify conflicts, errors, and omissions. I'm going to go into more detail on all of these in just a minute. 13% project issues, disputes not handled well. 13% scope of services not clearly explained to the client. So these are pretty significant issues. It's also one of our largest risk drivers by claims count, communication, and yet we feel very strongly there are many ways to address this. So when we say lack of procedures, the projects didn't have a risk management plan. They didn't have a project management plan. Some of them didn't have kickoff meetings. Some of them didn't have any meetings with the client. They didn't have a way of regularly confirming information with the client as they walk through the project. They didn't talk to the client about contingency or they didn't show them or have a written quality management plan. All of these created problems on the project that were related to communication issues around scope. 13% of scope services, there was just lack of an ability to communicate with the client on, I know what we're doing, but in terms of ensuring that the client knew what you were doing and what it meant, that didn't happen. So while you feel comfortable with what you're doing because you have the experience and you're familiar with your process, the client weren't necessarily on the same page, and it creates a problem. Now, lack of documentation is really critical on any project. If there's any change, if there's any adjustment to the project, it needs to be put in writing. Even a simple email is helpful. The old adage, if it's not written down, it didn't happen, is it true 100% of the time. Whenever you get into an uncomfortable situation or you start to have issues on a problem, on a project with a client. Quality management. Lack of QA/QC procedures to reduce errors, that's 63%. No proactive plan to handle project disputes. This is a big one. What if we start to see that we're having problems on a project? What are the steps that we take to address that and make sure that we don't let the problem linger or hope it goes away, because neither one of those are really a solution if you are running into problems on a project. So because maybe we didn't do a plan or have a kickoff meeting on the project with the client, how we're moving forward, how we're executing the project doesn't necessarily help the client when you start to have problems. So the other part of this, though, and I think it's really critical, is as project managers and as architects and engineers who are moving projects forward, we really need to recognize the need to address problems early and not hope that they get better or hope they go away. Even if we're really busy, we really need to address the problems early. On the risk driver number 6 by claims count, negotiations and contracts, in a unclear or inappropriate scope of services is a significant problem around change in scope or additional services on a project. We've seen the biggest increase over the last 6 years on this particular risk driver, from 26% to 45%. Unclear, inappropriate scope of services. So we craft a scope of services that are appropriate for the project, or at least we think it is, but we don't necessarily follow up and really check, did that really work? What happened on this project? What changed? What should we account for next time when we bid the work or when we complete a project like this again? If you don't have a kickoff meeting with the client, you don't have an internal kickoff meeting with anybody on your team that's working on the project, this also creates problems because people dive into the work and it's not necessarily clear who's doing what and when, but you kind of know where you're going. And I want to avoid that kind of know. I want you to know. I want people to know. I want a clear understanding of what they're responsible for, where the work stops, where the work ends. And then there's also the need as you go through the project to check in and have a formal process to do that. So what we see at the end is we have these 3 risk drivers that are greatly impacted by change and management of scope on a project. Over 80% of the problems and claims risk drivers around communication are related to scope. 45% of the issues around negotiations and contract are related to scope, and 33% of quality management are related to scope and change management. With that, we are at the end of the first section, and I want to start by asking, does anybody have any questions related to risk drivers?
You've been super clear so far, Patty, so there are no open questions at this point. But
Okay.
if anyone has any questions, they can feel free to add them in, but we'll
Okay.
go on.
There's a point that I would like to emphasize, and a lot of the time what we see out there, especially when we're working with new clients, is what Patty talked about with regards to identifying conflicts and disputes early and addressing them. And it seems as though a number of professionals out there are really hesitant to engage their professional liability insurance providers at the early stage of a dispute. And the fear is that if they say there's an issue, there's a possibility of their insurance premiums going up. And that's a false misconception. With some of the, I'd say, higher quality professional liability insurance providers out there, they encourage people reporting disputes early, and they actually provide you guys with the resources and experts to brainstorm ideas with on how to resolve these disputes early. And a lot of the times it's drafting a letter or an email to your client, the project owner, and the rest of the construction team to establish your position. You know, I've been seeing a lot of delay claims going on lately, and all the consultants are being alleged for delays, but really not everybody is responsible for that portion of the project and the specific issues that relate to the delay. And so in these types of circumstances, our clients will work with us and the insurance providers to properly draft correspondence to the project team to release them from those allegations so they can move forward to have a successful project. And engaging us and the insurance company to provide this advice and service doesn't cost them anything. It doesn't impact their claims history, and it doesn't impact their insurance premiums. It's truly a value-added resource. And once clients start to become familiar with it, know the consultants that we work with, develop rapport, they end up using it a lot more often and are much more comfortable in engaging them moving on.
Thank you, Rob. I just want to add, at ACEC-XL, what we have learned is that our insureds who actually take advantage of what we call this early support, when they first identify a dispute before it really escalates, we have found in our data that over 80% of those disputes are resolved without any further complications. So there really is an advantage to getting engaged early and taking advantage of the services that your insurance company provides. With that, let's move on to the next section, scope management. I'm going to start with some fundamentals here. So in this section, we're going to talk about what is defining a project. I'm going to spend just a little bit. I've done entire 2, 3, 4-hour segments on just project planning, and I'm going to show you one slide on project planning. So you're truly getting an overview here. I'm going to talk about a kickoff meeting and then common mistakes when putting together project scopes. So the 3 fundamental elements, I told you I'm taking you back to the basics here. Scope, schedule, budget, the 3 fundamental elements of any project. You do not have a project unless you have all 3. The really important aspect of this very fundamental concept is this. If you change any one of these 3 elements, you have to adjust the other 2. And people forget this, particularly when it comes to doing additional work for a client or managing change on a project. So if you change any one of these 3, you have to look at the other 2 and see how they're impacted, because there is an impact. Now, with those 3 fundamental elements, they all have constraints. Those constraints are really related to risk, quality management, resources, and those will also impact how you get the work done. So if there's a certain amount of risk, you may adjust your scope of work to make it less risky. If you have a quality management process that you follow, you have to make sure it's adequate for the work that you're doing. And then you also have to make sure you have the right resources available to do the work. When we talk about defining a project, there are 4 things, 4 tools that you can look at and define. And I'm going to focus for just a minute on the project plan, because the project plan, if you have a robust project plan, it actually addresses client objectives, client goals, and client deliverables. Now, as I mentioned, I spend entire programs just talking about project planning, but I'm going to give you just a quick summary in this section. So what's the plan for executing your project? And that's really what it comes down to, and it's really why I'm a huge supporter and why I have in my past used project management plans to get a project started off correctly. There's a big shift when you move from we won the work and here's what we told the client we are going to do in the proposal, which is great. There's a big shift from that to how are we actually going to execute the work. A lot of us in the industry have a great design process. We have a great process for how we do our engineering, and we understand that process, but that process is one part of how do you successfully execute the project. And that's what you really want to do with the planning. We know how we do our design, we know how we do our engineering, but how do we execute to make sure the team, the project team, any stakeholder on the project and the client are on board with where things are going. So there's two aspects of this, the project plan at the beginning of the project, and then having a kickoff meeting to make sure everyone understands what the plan is and how you plan on executing. Now, I really think that if more time were spent on this part of the project, and I've seen it play out on projects I've worked on in the past, this is a thing that will make a difference later on in the project. This will save you time, it will save you money, it will save you a tremendous amount of headache if you can address and spend just a little bit of time early in the project instead of after you've already started working on the project. So your project management plan, on one hand, what we want to do is we want to confirm what we thought we understood the client wanted in their request for a proposal and how we responded, okay? So we want to clarify that, and we want to have one more chance before we really jump in and start spending a lot of time and money on the project. We also want to talk to the client and the project team and any stakeholders, including sub-consultants or subcontractors. We want to talk to them about how we as a team are going to communicate. What's the best way? Do we have preferences? What are they? How do we make sure we're clear? And it's not just a weekly or a monthly meeting. How are you going to manage any of the communication and requests in between those more formal engagements? And then we're going to clarify and, of course, confirm the scope, schedule, budget. We're going to talk about the team's schedule and scope. We're going to talk about the client's schedule, and because they generally have input and they generally have some of their own deadlines they have to meet to keep the project on schedule as well as on budget. We're going to talk about project risks, and I think this is really an important step in planning a project. Where do we think we could run into problems, and how are we going to manage those problems? How are we going to mitigate or avoid those problems? And this is something I would like you to talk with your client about, because I really think they need to understand some of these issues. It also is an opportunity for you to talk about unknown conditions, unexpected events that could impact the project and how that could impact the project, just to let them know that, one, you understand how these projects work, two, and so they have the right people, two, you also want to communicate with them so they're not surprised by anything. And then again, you're going to talk about how you incorporate your quality process into the project. And I think all project management plans should talk about how you manage additional services or change on a project. Projects of any size, I think, should have some version of a kickoff meeting. If you have small routine projects with the same client, you may not need to do that because you have an understanding and it's a routine project. But as projects grow in fee or in duration or complexity, I think having a kickoff meeting becomes just a critical piece of your project. And in fact, again, the more time you can spend up front on a project planning and making sure everybody's on the same page when you start, the better off your project is in the long term. I have had people say to me, and maybe some of you even think this, you know, it's great to do planning, it's great to have a kickoff meeting, but 3 days later, everything on the project changes. And my response to that is, that could be. But if you did not have the kickoff meeting, you wouldn't have known, you would not have been able to articulate what changed to the client. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to put a stake in the ground and say, here's where we're starting, here's all of our assumptions, here's how we think this is going to go. And if 3 days later something changes, at least you can recognize it, you can articulate it, and you can say, you know, this isn't what we talked about, Mr. and Ms. Client. So I think there's a real opportunity here to take advantage of the fact that you had this clear start. And then when things change, you can come back to what your clear starting point was. So change, as part of this discussion, as part of your early planning with a client, I want you to talk about how you manage change. Now, believe it or not all change adds cost to a project. Some changes actually save money on a project. Either way, I want the client to understand that you have a process that you follow, and it's very matter of fact. This should be a very matter of fact discussion. It's not about I'm trying to start getting more additional work or asking you to pay for more things on the project, or maybe we didn't scope this appropriately and now we're trying to make up for it. I don't want any of that discussion. This is just, here's a process that we follow, here's how we communicate, and here's what you'll see on your end when we do have a change or additional services that are needed on the project. So here's some topics, here's some areas where this could come up, but I really would like you to either walk through some version of this, because these are just a small example of changes that could happen on a project, but have the conversation with the client. You have a process, you're just telling them about the process, and so they won't be surprised, or you don't have to walk them through it when you have change or additional services on a project. So some of the common mistakes: a vague scope of work. There are some projects you take on where the initial phase of work is really just defining the project. So I want to define the work, and when I'm defining this work, what I would like you to do is say to the client, we have a certain amount of money and we have a certain amount of time, and with this schedule and budget, we are going to use it to define the work. We're not going to jump ahead and start doing work on parts that we think we're probably going to do anyway. No, we're going to define the work, we're going to get agreement, because that's what the very first part of this work is. Then we're going to jump into the more well-defined pieces of work. The notion that you should just start working and figuring it out is really going to lead to delays, and I think even scope creep on a project. Large tasks. If you have large tasks and you haven't broken them down to small tasks, the people who are working on those tasks can lose track of or not clearly understand interim deadlines on projects or interim schedules and budgets on those tasks. Poor documentation. If you're not keeping track of changes, if you're not putting it in writing, if you're not talking to people about problems or issues and maybe trying to address those quickly, it can lead to problems. No clarification of assumptions. We all have assumptions that we put into any cost that we make. It can include weather, it can include permitting time, it can include how quickly the client can get documents reviewed. It includes quite a few assumptions. We need to talk with the client about those as at the beginning of a project. Unfortunately, some of us do have projects where we have overlooked tasks. This requires quite a bit of discussion, I think, internally as well as externally when that happens. Hopefully, it's more of a lessons learned, and you can move forward and not do that on future projects. And then finally, we always have a list of responsibilities for the client when we start a project. I would like them to have that list and their own client schedule on the project presented to them at the beginning of the project. And I want that discussion to happen at the beginning of the project so the client knows what's expected from your end, and maybe have a discussion about what it means to them or how they want to manage that. And with that, we are at the end of the second section. Carolyn, do you have any questions?
There is a question, Patty. Jake was curious about the shift now to the digital environment. So do you think when we're hosting meetings like this, typically we have things in person, someone might take meeting minutes, but when we're hosting like this, do you think that it would be good practice to ask to record the meeting to maybe feed into some of the risk plans and client plans, those sorts of things?
I think when you're having a meeting like this, I'm not a fan of recording in particular, because then it requires that you would have to go back and manage all of that. What I would prefer, anytime you have a meeting with the client, And whether it's a formal planned like weekly or monthly meeting or just a phone call where you're trying to talk about an issue, at the end of the call, you write an email, you discuss the important pieces of information. For example, we had a call about this particular issue, and here's how we decided to address the issue, and here's how this resolution impacts the schedule or budget, if it does, on the project. And you send them that email and you say, you know, with this, I want to confirm our conversation. So the recording doesn't really help you, I think, as much as having just a summary that you email to them and asking them to say, do you agree or disagree? Or if I don't hear back from you, I'm going to assume you agree with what I've written in this email, and we're going to move forward with that.
I always figure that the person who takes the minutes gets to set the tone there. So there's a question that's come in on the chat from Max, who wondered what some strategies or advice might be when building a scope of work to ensure it's not too constraining.
That it's not too constraining. I'm not sure what not too constraining means. My preference is to have a detailed scope of work. My preference is always to have a detailed scope of work. Maybe not one that the client sees, but the one that I have as a project manager that I can use, because I'm trying to delegate work, I'm trying to track work and follow up. So I prefer more detail, because that helps me recognize if there's a shift or a change in the work, or if we're starting to spend more time on a particular area than I had planned. It gives me a more immediate indicator if I have the details. So it also, though, provides me with an opportunity to talk with the client if they're asking for something different, because I can say to them, well, here's what we had planned, and this really wasn't part of the plan. So then I have an opening to talk with the client. I don't necessarily feel detailed scopes of work constrain me. I think they help me.
Okay.
A question that you just reminded me of, Patty, that I get quite often when I do these workshops myself is, you know, how much detail is too much in a scope of services? Because when we talk about scope with clients, it's, you know, include items of what you're going to do, what you're not going to do, what's going to be the responsibility of others, and what items are going to be considered additional services for additional money. And, you know, some consultants start thinking that, you know, I should be doing a real detailed scope and I should be including, you know, everything that we're particularly not going to do. But then at the same time, there's thinking that they don't want to scare the client away by having too much information in there. So is there a balance to be struck, or some guidelines that you can suggest?
My rule of thumb, and I don't have any legal basis for this, so but we have attorneys that could answer this question at ACEC-BC. But my rule of thumb is this: always tell people what you're going to do. Okay, not necessarily give them a 2-page list of what you're not going to do. And here's why. If you tell people what you're going to do, if there's a question about what's not included, you can come back to the list of here's what we're going to do. Now I have seen some examples of those where they have this 2-page, it doesn't include this and this and that, and you're like, oh my God, that is scary to me. And if I'm a client, I'm thinking, well, okay, so you have 3 paragraphs of what you're going to do and 2 pages of what you're not going to do. I have to read through those 2 pages. So what I really want people to do is focus on what you're going to do. And then if for some reason, I know there are, you know, like municipalities and state and provincial governments that probably want some kind of detail on what you're not going to do or what it doesn't include on one hand, but you should always start on really spending your time on here's what we're going to do and try and be as clear about that as possible. So if there's a question, you can come back to that list first. Carolyn, any other questions?
That's it for now. Why don't we keep
Okay.
going, and we'll see what I can come up with for the next one.
Okay.
Great questions from everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. I think you make a really good point with that, though, because I've seen those. I've seen the here's what we don't do. And you're like, oh, all right, let's talk about change management. So, wow, I need to learn how to use my mouse here. Sorry. We're going to talk about 3 different aspects of change management. First, what is change? Second, what drives change? And I talked about some of these risk drivers at the beginning of the program. And then managing change. So what is change? Or additional services? Any change to the project scope that almost always, notice I don't say it does require, but almost always requires an adjustment to the project cost or schedule. And then the second part of change is scope creep, adding features to the project without addressing the effects on time, cost, resources, or without client approval. So scope creep is not the same as scope change, because in scope change, we're making the assumption that you actually get paid for the work. Scope creep, we're assuming that you're not paying attention, or somehow you think you're going to be able to fit it in with the existing scope, schedule, and budget, and it may or may not work out that way. So what drives the change? We have self-induced change. The project team makes a decision, or somebody on the team makes a decision to do the work a certain way or take a certain approach to it, and it's not the approach that you really had the budget for example. Number 2, rework. Again, this is self-inflicted. And what I mean by self-inflicted is there was an internal miscommunication or a mistake, and we had to do the work over. And it was truly a problem that we created. It can be as simple as our server went down and we lost a lot of work that we couldn't recover, to we had somebody make a mistake and we had to fix a mistake. 3, client. Client drives a lot of change. What we have to do is try and be clear and communicate with the client about when that is a change and how it impacts the overall project. And then 4, of course, we have unknown conditions or unforeseen events, and those should be, again, covered initially. When those things happen, there should be some language in your contract to address that. But what you really want to do at the beginning of the project, when you're talking to the client about project risk, you talk to them about unknown conditions or unforeseen events as one of the risks that you will have to manage on the project and may come up on the project. And that's why I really want to have that upfront discussion with the client on the meeting, because you can talk about particularly their desire to make change as they go through the project, and any areas where you have no control that may impact the project scope, schedule, or budget. Internally, here's a list of items that may or may not be things you can manage or that you can control. So we have internal versus external change drivers. If you look at the list, I want you to just mentally walk through it and think, well, which one of these are internal change drivers, which ones are external, and which ones are maybe both? So when you look at the list, we have client decisions, public acceptance, regulatory approval, errors or omissions, personnel changes, scope creep, unanticipated events, increased level of effort. Here's my answers. You may agree or disagree, but external, client decision, public acceptance, regulatory approval, I agree. Those are generally external drivers. We really don't have a tremendous amount of control, but we certainly have input, and we can communicate a process and communicate potential issues around any of those 3 areas to the client. Errors and omissions, personnel changes, scope creep, unanticipated events can be both internal and external impacts to a project. And of course, increased level of effort, generally that's ours. Generally, we decide something needs more detail, or it needs more work, or it needs to be changed significantly from what we had originally thought. That's the increased level of effort, and that is an internal change driver. With that, let's shift to change management. This is I think the real critical piece of this particular section. How do you manage this? We have all of these things that impact how we do our work. I'm surprised sometimes we can get out of bed in the morning knowing we're going to go in and work on this project, and all of these things can really come and change not only our day, but change an entire project. So this part to me is probably the most important part of this discussion, managing it. How do you manage it? I hope things go well. That's not managing it. Ignoring it, that's not manage it. So let's talk about how we manage this. One, I need you to recognize and identify the change. The reason I love having that time spent up front on a project to do a project plan, to talk to the client about how you manage change, is it gives you this stake in the ground. Here's what we're going to do, and this is, we're confirming this with you, and we want to make sure we're all on the same page. Then, if you do recognize change, when do you bring it up? When's the best time to bring it up? You should always, though, as part of having this discussion with the client, make sure you define how this change is going to impact not just this one little change, but the overall project. And you really have to be prepared to have that discussion before you talk to them about any change or any additional services. Obtaining approval is very important. Documenting it, also critical. And then you complete the work. So let's walk through this with a little bit of more detail. Recognize and identify change. You can have meetings with your principal in charge on the project or your senior manager on the project, talk with them about what's going on in the project, and maybe even discuss how you're having some issues with potential scope creep, or things are going differently than you thought, or they're taking longer, and trying to identify and break down what's causing that. Is it internal? Is it external? Is it additional services? Discuss client requested changes as soon as they arise. When a client calls and says, hey, can you take care of this for me? And you know, because you're very familiar with your scope of work, you know this is something new and it was something that you don't have a budget for, and you think to yourself, well, this will only take a couple of hours. I think we'll be okay. Say to the client, I'd be happy to take care of this for you. I'm not quite sure how it's going to impact our schedule and budget, but I'll let you know. I'll look into it and let you know. But yes, I'm happy to take care of this for you. And then also check in. If you have a larger project and you have multiple departments or people in multiple offices, or even more than 2 or 3 people working on your project, you should have a process for checking in with them on a regular basis. If you have 1 or 2 people, you can probably have, they'll probably come by and ask you questions as they're working on the project. That's one way of checking in. If you have very junior or inexperienced people, you're going to check in more often. Senior people probably less often, but you definitely need to check in as you go through the project. Now, there's a couple of ways you can approach this. You can have a weekly project meeting if you have a larger project. When you assign work, make sure the tasks are clear. Also, make sure that the amount of time they should be spending on the project, how many hours, okay, how many hours should it take you to complete this task, and when you need it. I don't want you to be anything less than over specific on this. For example, I need this by Friday at noon, not Friday at 5:30, because I have to look at it between noon and 5:30 and talk to the client about it. Okay, so I need this by Friday. I have 20 hours for you to do this piece of work. Now, if somebody's new to the project or new to work, they're inexperienced, you might have to break it down even further. So at 10 hours, you should have this. At 20 hours, I expect to see a draft. Confirm who's truly responsible. When you're delegating work, you need to make it clear this person is responsible for this part of the work. That's also then followed by, again, the discussion about hours and time, and then availability. If you're someone who's on the phone a lot, you may set up a time to talk with people in the morning, or sometime around lunchtime or at the end of the day, and make sure that they're on track with what they're responsible for on the project. So let's talk about discussions with the client. So in negotiation, here's the definition. Leverage is the power that one side of a negotiation has to influence the other side to move closer to their negotiating position. So when we're asking for a client to approve additional work that they've either requested or has become apparent is needed, we have to make sure that we are taking advantage of our leverage when we have this discussion. And you may think, well, we don't really have any leverage, but actually we do, because one, if they really do want the change or they have to address this, somebody has to do the work. So the party's leverage is based on its ability to award benefit or impose costs on the other side. So yes, the client may say, I don't want to pay for this, and you may say, well, then we can't do it, and here's how it's going to impact the project. So negotiation leverage, we both have it, but I don't want you to give up your leverage. So how can that happen? When do you have the most leverage to get approval for a change order or additional services on a project? Here's your 4 possible answers. Before starting work on the additional scope, while you're working on the additional scope, when you've completed the additional scope, when you've submitted your work to the client. I'm hoping everybody gets the right answer on this the first time. Before starting work on the additional scope. What I see happen pretty frequently, particularly if the client is impatient or the project has a very short deadline, is that people go ahead and do the work and then come back to the client and say, hey, we did this additional work and as a result, we're over budget and we would like to get paid for this additional work. And the client says, well, I didn't know it was additional work. You didn't tell me about it. Okay. And quite honestly, you can't blame them. You cannot blame them for saying, I didn't know it was additional. You agreed to do it. And now you're coming back after we're all done and you're asking for more money. It just doesn't seem right. Maybe you weren't managing your project well and you're just trying to get some money. But if you bring it up when it first happens, you're very clear with them about the fact that it's additional work and it requires an additional cost. When you have the discussion with the client about change, I want you to put some thought into this. I want you to have at your disposal, at your fingertips, how this change affects the project. So does it impact the goals or objectives? Does it impact the scope, schedule, or budget? Does it impact anything on their side? You're not worried about they're not worried about your staffing requirements. You need to address that. Does it impact anything that you have or that you would normally require as part of your quality process? And does it introduce any new risk to the project? Is this going to create some other problems down the road? I think you need to walk through those and be prepared to have that discussion with the client. Then, who's responsible for completing the work? And make sure you're clear about that part of the process. Third, last but definitely not least, have a discussion with the client. Be prepared and then have a discussion with the client about this change and all of these impacts, particularly to schedule, budget, and risk on the project. Now, a couple of other things I want to introduce here on change management. What will happen, and I really do want you to think about this, what would happen if we did not make the change? What would happen if we did not do the additional work or did not make an adjustment to the project? What would be the outcome of that? And I think you need to be prepared to have that discussion. 2, are there better, less expensive alternatives to this change that still meet the project goals? Have you evaluated this? Have you looked at this relative to what the specific request was or the specific problem? Make sure you have something else, if there is something else, another option when it comes to change. Have we fully evaluated and communicated to the client any impacts to other aspects of the project? Critical piece. How does this request or this change impact the rest of the project? It's our job to think about that. It's our job to communicate it. It's not the client's job to figure that out. We need to, this is where I think this is where we as professionals really add value to our clients. We're able to look ahead. We're able to take in the big picture as well as the details and provide them this perspective on the project. Can we reduce the scope of work in another part of the project to minimize any impact to the overall project schedule and budget? And that may be a discussion you have with the client who says, I don't want the overall project schedule and budget to change, but I still want this additional work or I still want this additional service. That's when you have to come back to them and say, okay, well, if that's the case, let's take a look at some other things we're doing on the project and see if we can get these costs fit by either removing or minimizing some other aspect or portion of the project. Also, when it comes to small changes, I think small changes are the most difficult thing to have a conversation about. I've worked with clients, private clients, not public clients, and when I've worked with them enough, we work out a system where I will keep track of small changes, and I tell them this. I would tell them this, I'm going to keep track, and if we get to a point where they really start adding up, I want to have a conversation with you about paying for these small changes because they really can add up. And where I think this conversation was easier for me to have is where I was working on a project that was very competitively bid, and we had to be very careful with our costs. So when clients were asking for all these little changes, I knew they were adding up, and I knew we really didn't have any wiggle room in our budget to make this happen. So on the left-hand side here, don't ignore these small changes. Even if you feel uncomfortable, talking with the client about them, I want you to come up with a process and really explain that to them. Don't wait until you're over budget or behind schedule. Say, well, we had all these small changes, and so now here's what's happening. You should have been communicating with them all along how some of these small changes really are impacting your overall plan for the project. That was on you. So you do need to be proactive about this. I didn't want the client to accuse me of nickel and diming them. That's kind of a low blow comment. I know people have had that said to them on one hand. On the other hand, here's why I like a project management plan. Here's why I like a kickoff meeting. You have a process for addressing and dealing with change. And you're talking with the client about it really early at the very beginning of the project before you do any work. And so for them to come back at that point and say, well, these are all small changes, that's when you say, yes, but here's how they've added up. So at the beginning of the project, talk about how you manage all change, big and small. On small changes, if you have this luxury, and it is a luxury because on some public projects you may not be able to do this, you maintain a log of these changes. And you're not going to talk to the client about them every time. You're going to say to the client, though, when you do have a small change, we're happy to do this for you. It's a small change. I am going to keep track of how much time and basically the cost of doing this small change on a log. And then update the client on this. Say, hey, this is a $25,000 project and we've already had $1,000 in additional small changes on the project. I just want you to know at some point we do need to sit down and talk about actually getting paid for these $1,000 of changes. But have the conversation. Don't wait until the end. Don't hope that they'll quit asking for small changes. Generally, they don't. Make sure you communicate that even though it's a small change, it's a small change, and you want to be able to certainly address that and provide that. But you also, if it's more than one or two, you really do need to get paid for these changes, which is why I really like the idea of a change log. Even when I put together a change log of small changes on a project, some of them I do not ask the client to pay me for it because they literally took like 30 minutes or an hour, and I had a $55,000 fee on the project. So I didn't really feel like I should. But if it takes 4 hours or 8 hours or 16 hours, that's different. And that's much more expensive, and it has a much bigger impact to the project profitability. All right, we are at the end of this section.
That's
Carolyn,
great.
are you seeing any questions?
Yes, Hamid has a question. So we'll just, it's a long one, so brace yourself.
Okay.
Okay, so the question really comes down to the point in the project where the engineer has to go to site and do inspection. This is a consistent problem where, making sure the communication happens between the contractor, the construction firm, and the engineer to make sure that those things line up. So the question from Hamid is, inspection of work is one of the major factors contributing to quality of the work and risk management for any project. engineers need some consent or permission from the builder or contractor to get on the site. And the builder usually tend not to call the engineer right on time for the inspection. So the engineer is left to go and inspect at a time when the work may no longer be visible. So the question
Wow.
really is around, when you have clear communication with the client, how can you enforce this requirement with the other party, the contractor? So it's basically making sure that all the points of communication. So if I'm clearly communicating with the client, is it their job to communicate that to the contractor, or is it my job to communicate that with the contractor?
Okay, the assumption is the client has a contract with the contractor and a contract with the architect or engineer, right? What has happened is if you're not getting the information in a timely manner so that you can come and do your inspection, and by the time you do get the information, the inspection has can't happen essentially. That contractor, in my mind, again, I'm not an attorney, but that contractor has created a risk for you, because as part of your contract administration, you were supposed to go out and do inspection of certain things. And now you're not able to inspect those things. So there has to be some documentation. If this is an ongoing problem, okay, I have to make sure that the client understands this, and you can offer some solutions. Please give us 24 hours notice. Please give us your anticipated schedule so we can block this time. But you do, as the designer or engineer on the project, you do need to document that this happened, that you were not able to see it, that you were not called at the appropriate time or not given enough time to get to the site. The client needs to be aware of it. It needs to be in writing, because if there's a problem down the road, you can get blamed for this. And I don't want you to get blamed for it. So I want you to have documentation. I don't know if our attorneys would say anything differently, but the documentation is important. I can't force a client's contractor to call me. Now, if I had the contract, yes, I don't. So I can't force that. The only thing I can do is let the client know, and then potentially try to work out some solution for them to be prompted or be more engaged in making sure that happens. Rob, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, Patty, you addressed it.
Okay. Any other questions, Carolyn?
No other questions at the time. And I think this is a point that a lot of practitioners here certainly think about. Obviously, when it comes to things like as-built drawings or complete drawing sets, that we typically will put a limitation of liability on those drawing sets. That's the recommendation of the regulators. So if you are required to stamp the as-built, you can basically say, I can only see what I can see. And so, to the best of my knowledge, but there may be things that I wasn't able to inspect. But I think good advice.
But I want you to be, when we say best of my knowledge, I really do want you to document what you actually could see versus what you couldn't. I think that's really critical, because that can come into play down the road. It really can. And on big projects, keeping track of that is it's a little bit daunting, I think, but you should be specific when that happens. All right.
So
yep.
Terry actually had a follow-up to that.
Okay.
The follow-up question was, can you compel the other party to uncover work if something like could between the contracted parties, can you say, look, I wasn't able to do my work, you're required to reverse your work in order to and to allow me to do mine? That's kind of a legal question.
It really is a legal question, and yeah, I think it is a legal question. I would love to be able to say, sure, you should be able to compel people to allow you to do your work on one hand. On the other hand, there's a cost for undoing the work. And I think the better situation, if I were in that situation, I would call Rob, who is my broker, and I would say, Rob, we're in this situation, and I would like AXA, if I'm your insured, I would like their help from our attorneys. I would like help with them to figure out how to address this or document it or be clear about what's going on. So I really do think at that point, it's good to get some legal advice. And we certainly have it available for our insureds in situations like this.
And that's what I was talking about before. So these services are available to a lot of the professionals that are on the call right now. Every one of these unique circumstances, needs to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. There's no general rule book that's going to apply to all these different scenarios, and you do have resources available to you to brainstorm the different approaches that you guys can take and to choose how you want to proceed to have a successful project and to protect yourselves.
Okay. Carolyn, anything else? We're good?
No, we're good for now, thanks.
Okay, so far, just in case everybody's concerned, we're on schedule here with things, so we're going to keep moving. Tools for change management. Now, having a discussion with a client about change, recognizing that you have a change, being willing to talk with the client about that change, document it, and get their approval, I think is very important. Well, here's some tools to help you do it. And I think this is also a critical part of this discussion, because these are tools you should probably present to the client at the beginning of a project so they know what they can expect on a project. First of all, I brought this up earlier. I'm going to bring it up again because I think it is so important when you talk to a client about any change on a project. If you are not willing, if you are not willing to walk through these steps before you talk to a client about change on the project, my advice is expect to not get a positive response or agreement, because you have not put together the thought or taken the time to make your case for the client. And if all you do is show up and say, hey, we did this extra work for you and we'd really like to get paid for it, and you don't have a lot more than that to offer, don't be surprised if they say no. So I want to make it hard for my client to say no when I've done additional work or provided additional services to them. I want to make it hard for them to say no, So before I talk to the client, I have a $2,000 change order on a $30,000 project. That is a big change order on a $30,000 project. Now, what if the client comes back to me and says, well, I don't want to pay for this part of it? First of all, if the client says they don't want to pay for part of it, and I haven't started the work yet, I'm like, great, we don't have to do it. But if I've completed the work and I'm coming to them after the fact, after the work is done, after they've received the work, much harder to make that case. So make sure you understand, I want to get paid for this whole additional piece of work. And if I don't, we can maybe do something different, but you are really putting that to the client. You're basically saying to them, here's what I need to make this happen. Make sure you understand what the client really is trying to get at if they're asking for additional services. Any concessions? Are there any other ways you can pay for this? Are there any ways you can offset this cost? Make sure you have that plan, or at least one or two options in your head. Always evaluate any other options. Now, if you've already completed the work, you don't have number 4. Actually, you don't have number 1 either. So you've taken off actually some pretty big pieces of opportunity to get approval here. That's why I want you to talk to the client before you start the work, Know that work. Know your existing scope of work, know what the additional scope of work is, know it better than anybody in the room. So when the client comes back and says something like, well, maybe you can reduce some costs later in the project, you have a list of 2 or 3 things where that could happen, but you also are prepared to talk about the consequences of making those changes. You have to have this information in your head before you go talk to the client, okay? Then I want you to practice talking about it. All right, I want you to actually walk through this. You might have to write it down. You don't have to take a piece of paper in with you to the discussion, but I do want you to have in your head this information so that if the client pushes back or says no, or I don't think that's extra, you will have walked through these options and you're prepared to have the discussion. Now, as part of that, last but not least on this is practice silence. And what do I mean by that? The client says to you, oh, well, you know, I just don't think I can see any way we should have to pay for this. Yeah, it may be extra, but you know, we're only halfway through the project, and you don't know if you're going to need all that money. And instead of responding immediately, just let it sit for a minute. Okay, just let it sit. Just think about it. And what I mean by let it sit, I mean 10, 15 seconds of you being quiet and thinking about it. And part of the reason I want you to do that is because we feel in these situations compelled to respond immediately. So the client says, oh, well, you know, I don't really agree with this. You know, we're only halfway through the project. There's still plenty of money. You can't tell me about, you know, you might immediately feel compelled to say, oh, well, okay, if that's what you feel, we'll figure out something. Okay, I don't want you to do that. I don't want you to fall prey to that. I better respond right away. I better say something right away. I want you to take the time and give them time to really think about what they were asking or saying, and then say to them, this is a specific additional piece of work. And yes, we may only be halfway through the project, but this additional work was not part of our original scope. So it doesn't matter whether we're at the first part of the project or the end of the project, this is additional work. And I want to make sure that we get paid for it. And I want to make sure you understand that we have presented you with other options and alternatives, and you still want this. So we do need to get paid for it. Have that discussion, be prepared, and that practicing silence. I've actually used this technique with people who have been, no, I'm not going to do this. I don't feel like I should have to pay for it. Yeah, well, it should have been in the original or scope of work, or you guys are the experts, so you should have known and you should have included it, or whatever excuse or rationale that they throw at you to kind of push you back a little bit. Just stop. I've had people say those things, and then I don't respond right away, and then they start to backpedal a little bit. Well, okay, I guess we can. I give them time. So use that technique a little bit. That's why I want you to have this information in your head, so you don't feel compelled to respond right away and say, oh, okay. You know, one of the things that's happening right now with a lot of AEs is their clients are coming to them saying, we want you to discount your work for a while, or maybe discount the project entirely given our new economic situation. My point on this is they're going to ask, okay? They're going to ask. It doesn't mean you have to say yes. What are your options? What are the alternatives? Okay, they're going to ask. It doesn't mean you have to say yes. The client's going to say no. It doesn't mean you have to accept it. Okay, right away. You don't have to say, oh, they don't want to talk about this. They're saying things like you're nickel and diming me. They're making all of these. Stop talking for a minute and come back and explain to them why it's additional work, how it's important to the project, and it doesn't matter whether it's at the beginning or the end of the project, it's still additional work. Obtain approval. I really want written approval. I don't want phone call approval. Email approval is better than nothing. But this is why I like having a tool where you can send something to them and they can either sign it or approve it with an email. Again, have a discussion with the client at the beginning of the project about how you manage change. This is an example of a template basically that you can fill out and provide to the client. You can show them this template at the beginning of the project and say, if we have a need to get paid for additional services or changes on the project, we're going to give you this template. And it's going to be filled out with all the information, and it's going to talk about the current scope, the reasons for the change, how much it's going to cost. We may attach a spreadsheet to it, but we're going to ask you to sign it. We're going to sign it just to make sure we're clear on what's going on and how it's impacting the project. This is very simple to execute, and I think having it at the beginning of the project tells the client you have a process. That this isn't some, well, we'll kind of see how things go, and we may talk about it, we may not. We have a process. Here's our process, and here's what you'll see if we have to follow this process. The other thing I would like you to do as part of submitting any change or additional service requests to the client is keep track of them with some kind of a log. So whenever you send the client a change order request, you also send them a summary, of course, of all the change orders that you've had up to that point, or additional service requests you've had up to that point. You're just keeping things current. If some of them are really small changes and you haven't asked to get paid for those yet, I might put those on a separate variance log. These are the ones that on this log that you really do want to get paid for, or you can put them all on here. Whatever is easiest for you, but you should keep track and let them know what the changes have been through the project. Once you have submitted this written request, I want you to document it. You will have clients who will sit on those written requests. They'll collect them. I don't know why they're collecting them. I think they just maybe are hoping they'll go away, or they'll come up with a reason why they don't want to pay them or something else. They'll collect them, and I want you to come back and try and get those signed information. I want that approval in writing before I do the work, okay? Now, if there's pressure constraints or something, the client says, just go ahead and get started. I'll get this to you. I'll get it taken care of, and they don't. Again, you've lost some of your leverage there, but I want you to submit the information, and then I want you to confirm, hey, we sent you this change request. Let me know if you have any questions. When you have meeting notes, I want you to talk about the change request that you've submitted and you're waiting for approval on. If you send progress reports, I also want you to note which change requests you're waiting and additional service requests you're waiting to get approval on. I want this to be part of an ongoing conversation on a project. It's not upfront, it's not item number one, but it's part of how we are communicating with our client, because truly it is just part of the project. So here's an example, a weekly progress report. I think these are a great tool for managing client and client expectations. It's very short. It's something you would send out every week on a project. It's less than 1 page long. I think the shorter, the better. Everything's bullet list. I'm not providing a tremendous amount of detail, particularly on the schedule and budget, except to say either we're on schedule or we're not, or we're within our budget or we're not. The change order status gives you a chance to say, yes, we've submitted requests for additional service or change orders 2 times in the last month, and we are still waiting for approval on those. And then, of course, other concerns and issues, but also just what are the outstanding invoices? You just list them and the date they were submitted to the client. You're just documenting every week what the status of the project is to the client. And clients really do love the first 2 bullet items. What did we get done? What are we planning on doing next week? It really gives them a sense that you are communicating with them on the project in this very simple way, but it's very effective. So here's an example of a weekly progress report. This is what you would send in an email: bullet items accomplished, will accomplish, any scope or additional services, status of the scheduled budget. Very simple. I'm not asking for we had a $250,000 project. We spent $149,500. We have this much left. We're this much. I don't want any of that. It's just, are you working within the existing budget and schedule or not? This is just a snapshot. You can give them a more detailed breakout if it's required as part of the contract, or you would like to provide that. I would do that very detailed breakout on schedule and budget in a monthly progress report or a monthly meeting with the client. List all your outstanding invoices. You're just listing them. You're not saying, hey, you need to pay these. You're just listing them. It's just a reminder. And then there's a space for other issues or concerns on the project. So it's a very simple format. It would take you probably about 10 minutes a week to put this together. The first one might take you a little bit longer, but it's fairly easy to update after that. Once you receive approval for a change, you need to update some documents. Okay? So if you had a project management plan for your project, I want you to go back and add this additional work into that project management plan, because your project management plan lists your scope of work, and now you've added work. And I want that to be current, because this project management plan is an evergreen document. It's updated as you go through the project. Revise your contract. You've now added work, and I want this additional work to be noted in the contract in case there's an issue or a problem. Your accounting system. Once you have approval for the additional work, I want you to take the money for that and make sure it's in your accounting system so you can track it. And then also I want you to update your project and task schedules. I want you to either include the new information as a task or within a task, and make sure it's reflected on your project schedule and budget. And with that, we're at the end of this section, and it's actually the end of the program sections. Carolyn, do you have any questions that have come up?
I do have questions that have come up. Okay, there are a number.
Okay.
So the one question from Jeff was about working directly versus indirectly for the client. So I think probably the answers are the same whether you're working with a subconsultant or the client, but Jeff was curious if you have any tips on negotiating these scope changes, extras when you're working through a third party. So you're not, you can't go directly to the owner, you're going to
Right.
your, to the prime consultant.
To the prime. I want you to do the same thing that you would do, and do the same preparation you would do as if you were going to the owner, right? Unfortunately, because you are a sub to a prime, you do not have the same leverage with the owner that the prime does. So what is your leverage with the prime? I have heard over the years, and I've probably seen some examples of this too, where a sub to an architect who's a prime, the architect isn't comfortable going to the client and asking for this additional service. And that's something you and the architectural firm have to work out. And it's unfortunate, but apparently it does happen more than people would like. So you are constrained. You are constrained to actually working with your prime on the project, but make that same case, provide that same information, make sure you talk to them before you do the additional work.
Great. Okay. So Jason really appreciates the guidance you've offered with respect to the power of silence. I think effectively employed by our Prime Minister yesterday while he waited to figure out what he wanted to say, or 2 days ago.
Oh, really?
Yeah, very, very effective. Okay, so the question though is, when you're negotiating, sometimes you're having these conversations by email, right? So you're not necessarily picking up the phone or being able to meet in person. So have you got any advice for the members on the phone about how to deal with having that sort of silent space for contemplation when you're doing written conversation?
See, this is where I think I would say I would want to have a conversation with you, not just do this through email, because email, for you to negotiate a small change or even any kind of change on a project through email, you spend so much more time writing out the email and going back and forth with that than if you just had the phone call. So if it were up to me, I would push really hard to have the phone call, and then you just document what you agreed on after the phone call in your email, which is much less and a much shorter string of emails. So I'm trying to avoid going back and forth like 20 times with emails, which can take hours and hours of your time. And in fact, it may even take so much time that that by itself is a small change order on the project. So I am going to present the client with the information through an email and say I would like to, or whoever, the prime, and say I want to have a discussion about this. And if they insist on only resolving this through email, you may not have a choice. But at that point, I would end the email with the request for the change and say, I would like to set up a time to talk with you about this, and be very clear about it. They go, oh, I'm too good. Well, no, anytime. I'm available. I have quite a bit of availability to discuss this. It's only going to take a few minutes. I would much rather have a phone conversation and then document what we discuss in the phone in an email. That's my first choice.
Yeah, I think we often forget about the option to actually pick the phone up and have a conversation. And it's been really interesting having conversations with clients, especially over the last couple months, because we're all working from home. Clients have actually replied that they're a little more flexible in terms of being able to accommodate meetings, whether it's a virtual meeting or a telephone call. So I think that's helpful from the perspective of having those conversations.
And I've heard, oops, go ahead, Rob.
General rule that I communicate to my team is that anytime there's going to be more than 3 emails going back and forth to address any issue, pick up the phone, because you've already wasted too much time doing it. Just pick up the phone, talk to the person, hash it out, and create an action plan to move forward.
Yeah, I think there's a real time-saving efficiency with having a phone call. The reluctance to not have a phone conversation, a direct verbal conversation, is in part due to the fact that maybe you haven't thought through the process well enough to be comfortable having a conversation. So if you're really uncomfortable because you haven't walked through the process, I still want you to walk through the process of, I need to make my case on why they should pay for this. If I have to make some notes and write it down, that's great. If you're really uncomfortable, write out that pretend email that you would have sent and make all your points. Have that in your head and then call the client. And so when you're confirming, you're just deleting stuff or making some minor adjustments and sending them the email, but you're not going back over. You can send a client an email on scope change and they can answer one part of it or address one part of it. And then you still have these like 3 or 4 parts of your request that are not answered. Then you're going back and forth. And it becomes, in my mind, just a huge waste of time. And I'm trying to avoid that. We got better things to do. So.
And that's a tip, Patty, that I personally got out of the workshop that we do on email management and best practices. And it's
great.
You draft up that email, you kind of vent onto the email if you're frustrated at the same time. You digest it, it's all there. And then you pick up the phone, you speak with your client or whoever it is that you need to talk to. You go through all the facts, and right then and there, you also have the email pretty much locked and loaded, ready to go as a follow-up with some minor tweaks in the end based on your phone call. It's a great practice.
Great.
So Julian had a question about project management in terms of the time that you spend doing different aspects of it. So basically that project management takes quite a lot of an engineer's time. Do you have a guideline for the portion or the percentage of the project management time allocation that should go to change management in general?
To change management. Well, in general, just overall on most projects, the typical project management budget, which then reflects the time, is around 10% of your project fee. So right there as a project manager, any project management activities you're expecting to take about 10% of your project fee. Now, with that, when it comes to change management, I think it depends on the complexity of the project. And I think it also depends on the type of project you're working on. So if you're working on a vertical construction project, you're probably going to spend more time on change management than another type of project. But if you have a client who is particularly either inexperienced or a client who is really demanding for some reason, you may spend a lot more time on that. However, it should still fit within that overall about 10%. Now within that 10%, you're not just doing, you're not just managing a change, you're also, updating the project, you're also managing subcontractors and subconsultants, you're also doing a variety of other things as part of managing the project, communicating with the team, having team meetings. So all of that fits in there, but if you are starting to really see that your project management budget is being impacted because you would typically see, I don't know, 5 additional service or change requests, changes on a project, and suddenly you're at 10 or 15, that tells you that you're in a different situation with this project and that you need to start accounting for how you not only manage your PM time, but make sure you get paid for those additional scope of services. And your additional scope of services actually may include time to manage the request and process it through the project. So it's not impacting your 10% project budget so much, particularly if you have a higher than usual number of scope or additional service requests on a project.
Thanks, Patty. I think we're getting pretty close to the end, so I just wanted to check if you had anything you wanted to add to wrap up, or otherwise we'll do our wrap up and let everyone go.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to work with Metrix always, so thank you, Rob, for inviting me and to do the program. And also, I'm very pleased we were able to present this for ACEC-BC, my favorite province. Don't tell anybody else that. Anyway, I'm very happy to be here. So thank you for your time today.
Rob, did you want to add anything before we all sign off?
Yeah, just thanks to everyone for attending and asking great questions. And we look forward to continue to be a resource for ACEC-BC.
Thanks to both of you, and thanks to everyone out there for participating for us today, for your questions. There were a few questions that I answered by texting back to you. Most of those related to the answer of yes, you will get a copy of the presentation. We'll send that out to you. It was excellent. Thank you, Patty. We'll send that out to you later today or tomorrow. We have your email addresses. So. And remember to stay up to date with us on industry news, resources, future webinars by visiting our website, acec-bc.ca. That concludes today's session. We look forward to your participation in upcoming webinar event. Thanks again to everyone.
Thank you.